Do you guys ever get nervous that fans know more about this than you?
100%.
Yeah.
But
Because they probably do.
You laugh, it's funny.
In 1956, Tolkien was approached by an American filmmaker interested in creating an animated Lord of the Rings film. Initially, Tolkien was in favor of the project, but when he received a copy of the proposed script, he was furious at what he saw. The script was filled with major changes to the story that were completely uncalled for. For instance, Radagast was changed into an eagle, and the eagles provided flying taxi service for the characters throughout the story. Orcs were redesigned with beaks and feathers. Lothlorien was transformed into a tiny fairy castle, and Galadriel a fairy queen. But perhaps worst of all, Sam actually leaves Frodo behind with Shelob and takes the ring to Mount Doom alone. Needless to say, Tolkien was not putting up with it. In what we now call Letter 210, he scathingly critiques the script, which, in his own words, murdered the original story rather than adapting it. Referring to the scriptwriters, he wrote the following: "They may be irritated or aggrieved by the tone of many of my criticisms, but I would ask them to make an effort of imagination sufficient to understand the irritation, and on occasion the resentment, of an author who finds, increasingly as he proceeds, his work treated as it would seem carelessly in general, in places recklessly, and with no evident signs of any appreciation of what it is all about." Tolkien's work treated carelessly in general, often recklessly, and with no appreciation for its deeper meaning? Are we sure he wasn't prophetically writing about Amazon's The Rings of Power?
They come with fire. They come with axes. Gnawing, biting, breaking, hacking, burning. Destroyers and usurpers, curse them!
No, Tolkien definitely wrote those words in 1958 about a film that, thankfully, never came to be. But his words are painfully appropriate for the tragedy of wasted potential that is The Rings of Power. This adaptation of Tolkien is filled with exaggerations, additions, and unnecessary changes to Tolkien's story. Migrating hobbits who call themselves Harfoots? Orcs that immediately burn in the sunlight? Mithril containing the light of Valinor and being necessary for the elves to survive? Do they really think they've made a faithful adaptation?
But when you guys went into it, was it important for you guys to kind of almost go into it with a clean slate, to think, right, we're going to tell our story, and hopefully it will,
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, I would just say, it's not our story. It's Tolkien's, and we just feel very fortunate to have been in a place in our lives and our careers where when we looked at the books, we were like, oh, well, obviously that's the story. And then our job has just been to kind of steward it along in a way.
That's a filthy lie!
It's not hard to imagine the resentment Tolkien would feel at the recklessness with which J.D. and Patrick have adapted his story to screen.
Pure ignorance, sheer stupidity, and wild recklessness.
Having watched the series through twice, I think the term adaptation is the wrong word for The Rings of Power. It's more like a well-funded work of fan fiction, which is at best only mildly entertaining. On the positive side, the show has an outstanding soundtrack, overall good costume and set design, and some surprisingly likable characters in the Dwarves and Harfoots. And to be fair, JD and Patrick do succeed in capturing at least one of the major themes in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. More on that later. But JD and Patrick made a lot of major changes, not just to the story, but to the very nature of Middle-earth. A few adjustments here and there are to be expected when you're adapting a book to TV screen, but JD and Patrick have taken so many liberties with the Rings of Power that it just feels disconnected from Tolkien's works. It's not bad at times, but it mostly just feels like a prequel to the Shadow of Mordor games, rather than a serious adaptation. Honestly, there's so much wrong with this series that it's hard to know where to start, so we may as well just jump right in with the story.
What are we waiting for?
The main character in this series is Galadriel, who is compulsively obsessed with avenging the death of her older brother. Her obsession with revenge is so toxic that Gil-galad banishes her from Middle-earth because he thinks she's poisoning the souls of the entire elvish race, causing them to fade away. We'll get back to that point later. So she gets on a boat to Valinor, but at the last minute she jumps off and attempts to swim several thousand miles back to land. On the way, she meets Halbrand, who is Sauron in disguise. But don't bother asking how he got there or where he's going, because the show isn't going to bother to answer either of those questions. Elendil comes across them and takes them back to Numenor, where Galadriel generally acts like a petulant child.
It is because of the elves that you were given this island. Surely you can spare a few planks and a rudder.
And also threatens to murder multiple people.
The elf means.
Then if blood be the price of passage, I will pay it. But one way or another, I will depart.
I'm afraid the Queen has charged me with seeing to it that you cause no further disturbance.
Suppose the words never manage to escape your throat.
Calm yourself and get yourself some chestnut pie.
Now, while all that was going on, Gandalf falls from the sky and hangs out with some hobbits. Confusingly, these hobbits call themselves Harfoots.
We're Harfoots!
But otherwise, they're no different from the loyal, good-natured hobbits we know and love. They would never leave you behind. But if you break your ankle and can't carry your cart, you might be on your own.
Tomorrow we depart as planned. And the Brandyfoot cart will be with us. At the back of the caravan. At the back? At the back.
We can't carry the cart without you. We're going to be left behind.
Seriously, we need to talk about how heartless these hobbits are. They go from tearfully remembering some of their dearly departed to laughing at the death of another hobbit within seconds.
Daffodil burrows. Wolves.
We wait for you.
Lovo Baljabook. Bees. We all loved him, but he was an Egypt. We wait for you!
Luckily, Gandalf was there to push the cart for them, because these hobbits weren't going to lift a finger to help one of their own who could barely walk, much less pull a cart. Back in Numenor, Galadriel goes to a library and discovers the orcs are gathering in a place called the Southlands, which is basically Proto-Mordor, where a bunch of made-up people live. She also discovers that the emblem Sauron in disguise is wearing is the symbol of the king of the Southlands. So she gets the bright idea to take a Númenórean army back to the Southlands, kill the orcs, and install Sauron in disguise as king. There's just one problem. Nobody wants to go to war for her. The Queen Regent Miriel, who gives a new meaning to the term Black Númenórean, has no reason to fight for Galadriel, and Sauron in disguise is right where he wants to be, establishing himself in Númenor to corrupt the people there. But the plot must go on, so Miriel changes her mind, and after Galadriel tries manipulating and lying to win over Halbrand, Sauron, she offers this very sincere apology and tries to convince him again.
I was wrong to use you. For that I am sorry. Tomorrow, the Queen will call you to audience. Your voice at that meeting may well decide whether this mission stands or falls. Help me.
I think I've helped you quite enough.
This doesn't seem to work at first, but he changes his mind anyway, even though there's no reason for him to leave. What comes next is a plot point so ridiculous that even though it was leaked, I could scarcely believe my eyes when I watched it.
Fighting at your side, I felt... If I could just hold on to that feeling. Keep it with me always. Bind it to my very being. Then
I felt it too.
Mr. Woods, I will ask you, coming to the end of my...
Thankfully, Mount St. Helens explodes and saves us enduring more of their blossoming romance. In the explosion and aftermath, Miriel gets blinded, Isildur is presumed dead, and Sauron gets stabbed by an orc lance and needs elvish medicine. Although he's on the verge of death, he is, luckily, well enough to ride a horse for 6 days straight to get to a Region.
Enemy lance. 6 days ago. We rode without rest. How?
Now, remember how Gil-galad was saying that the elvish race was dying? Yeah, turns out it wasn't actually Galadriel's toxicity. Instead, the elves are dying because they need the light of Valinor, which is apparently contained in Mithril somehow.
This Mithril. It is our only salvation. Nothing diminishes its light. We believe if we can secure vast quantities of it quickly, enough to saturate every last elf in the light of the Valar once more. And yes, it very well could be.
That doesn't make sense to me.
Unfortunately, all the mithril they have is this tiny fragment, because the dwarves think it's too dangerous to mine for. Celebrimbor doesn't know what to do, but luckily Sauron just so happens to be in Eregion to teach him basic principles of metallurgy.
Have you tried combining it with other ores?
An intriguing suggestion.
And they work together to create a totem that will keep every elf in Middle-earth from dying. At first they want to make a crown, but they decide 2 rings will work better.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Galadriel gets suspicious and confirms that Sauron in disguise isn't actually the heir to the Southlands, and when she confronts him, Sauron reveals himself.
I have been awake since before the breaking of the first silence. In that time, I have had many names.
Since they've developed feelings for each other, he invites her to become his queen and keep him on the straight and narrow while he rules Middle-earth with an iron fist. When Galadriel turns him down, he disappears. Now, at this point, you'd probably expect Galadriel to run to the forge as fast as she can and tell everyone that the suspicious man helping them was actually Sauron, and that these rings are probably a trap. But no, instead she says, let's make 3 of them.
Do we proceed?
No. We must make 3.
In case you haven't noticed, you've fallen right into my trap.
Now, before I start tearing into this disaster of a story, it might be helpful for you to know how the story actually goes. So here's the 10-second version of what Tolkien wrote in the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, which is what the Rings of Power is supposed to be adapting. Sauron comes to the elves in disguise, bringing powerful gifts and hidden knowledge. Celebrimbor is taken in, and Sauron teaches him how to make the 3 elven rings of power. But, as you all know, this was a trap, a plan created by Sauron to control the Free Peoples with his own Master Ring. But what on earth is Sauron's plan in the Rings of Power? When we meet him, he's shipwrecked with a bunch of extras in the ocean. Why is he with these people, and where were they trying to go? Are they trying to get to Numenor? That would make sense, since Sauron does go to Numenor in the appendices to corrupt the people there. But if his goal is getting to Numenor, why does he leave? He then ends up in Eregion with Celebrimbor completely by accident, and it's not even his idea to make the rings. The idea comes from Celebrimbor, and all Sauron does is teach him how to alloy mithril. He's just passively carried along with Galadriel, and seems to have no plan at all. I seriously wonder if J.D. and Patrick originally wrote Halbrand as a good guy, and changed their minds partway through, thinking, ooh, wouldn't it be cool if this guy was Sauron? That would throw everyone off. Even if they didn't change their minds about Halbrand, it's clear they made some last-minute changes to the story at some point late in production. In Episode 7, Galadriel tells Theo how her husband, Celeborn, died during the war with Morgoth. But she barely seems to care. All of her rage and pain originates with Finrod's death, not Celeborn's. Why make Galadriel care so much more about her brother than her own husband? It seems to me that originally, Celeborn didn't even exist in their script, but at the last minute they decided to add him in so as not to upset purist Tolkien fans.
There's no need to get angry.
Well, if I'm angry, it's your fault!
Speaking of Galadriel...
So it begins.
First, it's dishonest to even call this character Galadriel. She might have the same name, but she's the exact opposite of Galadriel in almost every way. Although she's the oldest elf in the series, with the possible exception of Adar, she is the least mature. She is brash, obtuse, reckless, dishonest, manipulative, and compulsively obsessed with revenge. In fairness, she gets a little better in episode 7 after her campaign to free the Southlands explodes in fire and ash, but she's easily the most unlikable character in the series, and it's never a good sign for the future of your show when your main protagonist is the worst character. But Galadriel and Sauron aren't the only casualties of this show's complete disregard for the source material. Since when does the High King of the Elves have the authority to grant and deny passage to Valinor? Since when do orcs immediately burn up in sunlight? Since when can a Palantir show visions of the future? How could hobbits, the most good-natured and loyal people in all Middle-earth, be content to let one of their own with a broken ankle get left behind and die? And worst of all, where on earth did they get the idea that Mithril shines with the light of Valinor and that without it the elves will die? It's so disconnected from what Tolkien wrote that even people who like the show have given up arguing that it's a faithful adaptation. And sorry, but taking iconic quotes from the books out of context and sprinkling them throughout the show as Easter eggs doesn't suddenly make it faithful. Though there are a lot of changes, they'd be a lot more forgivable if the show were well written and compelling. But in spite of being the most expensive TV series ever made, it feels like I'm watching a C student's final project. I mean, is this dialogue really the best they can do?
The sea cannot commit treason.
Hope is never mere, not even when it is meager.
What? Sometimes our island just needs a stretch. Just like you. There is a tempest in me.
The script makes constant attempts at cleverness and profundity, and every attempt falls flat. Even when it's not so bombastic, you can tell it hasn't been well thought out. Like this conversation about why stones sink and ships float. If you actually pay attention to what they're saying, their responses don't make any sense. Or how about Celebrimbor talking about caring for an aging parent?
They sculpt the rock with the respect of one who cares for an aged parent. I've long wanted to see them work.
That's definitely a concept elves will immediately connect with and casually bring up with each other. Dialogue aside, the plot isn't great either. I mean, this fan theory about Halbrand would have been a way better story than what JD and Patrick wrote.
This is from Rick_GSP. Halbrand will eventually develop feelings for Galadriel, but she will not correspond. He will get obsessed with her, and since she's an elf, he will seek immortality so both can be together always. And how's he going to achieve that? With a ring of power eventually turning into one of the canon Númenórean Nazguls. It's bold. Wow.
I like it.
I really like that. I would say that would be an absolutely banging storyline. Yeah. Well done, Rick_GSP.
Even after laying all this out, it's possible some of you still think I'm being unfair. After all, Tolkien's account of the Second Age is pretty bare bones, so you have to add some things and make changes for it to work as a TV series. Well, I totally agree, but Rings of Power simply takes its adaptive liberties too far. Adaptive anarchy is more like it. To illustrate, let's look at Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. Jackson made several significant changes to the story, but almost all of them were necessary to make the story work as 3 movies instead of 3 books. I mean, as much as I love the chapter The Scouring of the Shire, imagine how awful the Return of the King film would have been if the hobbits had to fight to reclaim their homes only 5 minutes after we watched Frodo destroy the ring. Some of the changes he made are more justified than others, but the vast majority make the movies better while being as faithful to the source material as possible. But here's some changes he didn't make. He didn't gender swap any of the members of the Fellowship to give it more female energy. He didn't replace King Theoden with Éowyn. And he didn't make up new rules for the world, like Mithril doubles as Nazgul repellent, or dwarves have perfect night vision. I could go on, but I think you get my point. In spite of all that's wrong, there were still some things that I think Rings of Power did well. Bear McCreary's score and his use of leitmotif is every bit as good as Howard Shore's. And aside from the artificially imposed diversity in ethnic groups that should be homogenous, I think they actually did a good job capturing the people and landscapes of Middle-earth. But my favorite thing about the series is that it touches on the theme of providence. While Tolkien never states it in explicit terms, the guiding hand of providence is a major part of both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. JD and Patrick have surprisingly picked up on that, and they successfully incorporate it into their story. The theme pops up several times, but it shines most brightly in episode 7 in this conversation between Galadriel and Theo.
There are powers beyond darkness at work in this world. Perhaps on days such as this, we have little choice but to trust to their designs and surrender our own.
My home is gone. Where's the design in that?
I cannot yet see it.
Although neither of them understand why they are suffering, Galadriel has faith that a higher power is watching over them and will make everything right in the end. Ironically, this is my favorite scene in the show. A conversation between this awful version of Galadriel and a made-up character that I just can't seem to care about. I just wish they had approached the entire show with this amount of respect for Tolkien's work. In the final analysis, The Rings of Power is a tragedy of wasted potential. With more funds than any TV series, and a passionate and active fan base, this could have been the touchstone for a generation if put in capable hands. Instead, it was given to writers who have never produced anything of note, with a superficial understanding of Middle-earth, and a disregard for the sanctity of their source material. It's not completely unenjoyable, but it's characterized by mediocre writing and uncalled-for alterations, making it feel more like a generic fantasy story than an adaptation of Tolkien. In short, this show feels like a well-funded fanfiction, and I'm just sad thinking about what it could have been. If you like what you heard, please help me out by liking, subscribing, and sharing with a friend. And thanks so much for watching. It really does mean a lot.
'Cause you freaking pricks just can't